Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rehash, a Web3 podcast. I hope all of our US-based friends had an enjoyable Thanksgiving holiday and week off to catch up on old podcast episodes you may have missed. I'm your host, Diana Chen, and on this episode, we're speaking with Brennan Mulligan, DAO Program Manager at SuperRare Labs, about effective leadership strategies in DAOs, new spins on progressive decentralization, and Brennan's new ultrarunning career and how that's helped him see the human body as a system, much like a DAO. If you're a DAO operator or a facilitator or manager in any organization, I think you'll really enjoy this episode and learn something new from Brennan. He shares so many insightful learnings from his time in DAOs and pulls from his background in cognitive science to really understand the ways in which people and organizations function. Brennan was nominated by Spencer Graham and voted onto the podcast by Spencer Graham and Feems. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Brennan. Hey, Brennan, welcome to Rehash. How's it going today?
It's going pretty good. How about yourself?
I'm doing really well, and I love to see your little counterpart, Bear, the dog, on the couch behind you. Hopefully she'll make a little appearance later and perk up and give her thoughts and feedback on DAOs as well. I'd love to hear it.
She's the one who writes all the proposals.
You know what? I have a dog as well, and I work for him, so I totally get it. This whole space is just run by dogs. DAOs, as we say. Huh.
That's totally not a legal strategy to limit regulatory risk by setting up a shell corporation in our dog's name and just, they told me to do it.
I don't see any lawyers on this call, do you?
I mean, there's one right there.
So, Brennan, I'm really excited to talk to you all about DAOs. You have been a full-time DAO contributor and just working in a variety of different DAOs for a long time. And we went through this phase of DAOs being really cool and it being really cool to call yourself a full-time DAO contributor and working on all these different DAOs. But that kind of died off a bit. And you don't see too many people nowadays deep in a bear market still calling themselves a full-time DAO contributor or even really spending too much of their free time in DAOs. So I think you clearly have a high conviction for DAOs to still be contributing to a variety of different DAOs. Could you maybe start off just by giving us a brief background and overview into your involvement in DAOs over the years?
Yeah, for sure. It's all been like mostly by accident. And it's pretty tied into how I got into crypto. I was working as a product manager in restaurant tech, like helping online orders happen. And one of the team members we just recruited was talking about like the prices are happening, all the typical bull market stuff. And I remember like, oh yeah, I was really into that stuff in college, but I didn't have any money back then to invest. And I didn't know that there were jobs. So I was like, that's just a sort of a cool thing that's happening over there. But I started to get more into it and start reading stuff. And I was like, whoa, yeah, this is super duper what I'm into. At the time I was into a lot of like org design and systems thinking, and all that stuff was happening in 2021 here. And so I was like, wow, I really want to kind of make this my home. So I took that whole summer to just read as much as I can, like went through every Vitalik blog post, all that stuff, and just completely lucked into a full-time crypto job in Austin. And I got introduced to ATX DAO at a marketing event. So I was one of the earlier members, not one of the founders, but in January 22, I joined up with about like 40 other people. And we were like, we don't know what we're doing. We live in the same city. We all love crypto. We all love DAOs. Let's start doing stuff together. So we made events and that sort of thing. But pretty quickly, Citicoin tried to move into Austin. And I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with the history, but they went into Miami, made a deal with the city council where they launched this thing. And supposedly it helps Miami in some way, but it was essentially an exit liquidity for stacks, and just the price tanked. And a lot of Miami residents suffered as a result. And so we didn't want that to happen in Austin. We started going to city council meetings, which got us invited to a couple like legislative committee sessions and stuff like that. And soon enough, we were working on a DAO bill. And so to see that transition from a group of people who want to hang out with each other to a group of people who are able to organize and take collective action, to that being seen by other power systems and the power of organization, that is what really got me convicted on DAOs. It's just a way to encourage bottom-up organization. And you're stepping into a group that maybe it has some sort of management structure where there's admin authority. It's not like a no holds barred free for all, But there is this basic assumption that I can bring myself more fully into this space and I can try to make things happen, which if you just show up at a job, maybe you don't have that assumption. And so I started working at SuperRare around the same time that we introduced our bill to the Texas legislature. That was September of last year. And it's kind of been history ever since. Like, got introduced to the HATS folks, and stuff has really kind of taken off for me since then as it dies down for everybody else, which has been a really interesting transition point as the DAO meme goes into decline is right when I entered. And it's been interesting to see those dynamics play out.
That is super interesting. I wonder if part of the reason it's sort of picked up steam for you is that you entered into the DAO space from more of a real world use case, like actually dealing with local city council and things like that, instead of in this very techie, theoretical, idealistic space that I think a lot of people enter into DAOs through, and they get kind of disillusioned by it. And then when it all collapses, like their dream collapses and they don't know how to deal with it. I wonder if that's part of it. But has your sentiment changed since you joined the space in the later end of the bull market until now, being deep in a bear market? Has your sentiment towards DAOs changed over time?
Not that much, because might be somewhat of a controversial take. I don't think they're that special. Like, they're a way of getting people together. They're not a new thing. They're a way to arrange people and power. And there have been systems that look like DAOs in the past. And we have this new technology that makes them more efficient to organize. I really believe in a lot of, where it makes sense, bottom-up organization and cultivating emergence and trying to model things to be more complex and dynamic. And that's really where I have a lot of conviction. And the DAO label is less sticky for me. It's more about how do I create a healthy system at a fundamental level. I don't really care what we call it. And seeing during the whole on-chain with or without a hyphen, and then DAOs or capture-resistant organizations, all these little Twitter debates, I just try to just keep chugging away, writing good proposals and working on my little piece of the garden.
Yeah, so you're not a purist in the sense of DAO has to be fully decentralized, fully autonomous, it has to be on chain, it has to be all of these things. In your mind, a DAO is more just like a type of organizational structure.
I guess I don't really care what the definition of a DAO is. I exist at this place and this time in connection with these people, and there's a system that I'm working on, and I'm going to make the decisions based in that context that I believe are best for that system. Having these mental models are useful, but they can also restrict our thinking and in a way produce a sort of like top-down hierarchical one-size-fits-all structure. So I don't even know if that's me saying I don't believe DAOs are necessarily on chain or whatever. It's more just, I think it's more useful to look at each organization individually and try to avoid those categorical labels as much as we can when it comes to practical application. Though, of course, it's useful in being able to context bridge and describe what we're doing to other people. And in that case, I think probably a looser definition of DAO is useful, because if you're trying to explain to your family at Thanksgiving dinner that the thing I work for is kind of a DAO, but like we don't have a governor contract yet, so we're not really sure what we are, it's going to get in the way of our ability to communicate clearly about the space. However, it is very important that we keep challenging ourselves to attain greater degrees of capture resistance, greater degrees of decentralization. And so maybe while gatekeeping isn't the answer, maintaining that sense of urgency certainly is.
And just for people who aren't familiar with the term capture resistance, I know we had an episode a long time ago, I forget, either with Spencer, Graham, or with Ninty Nick, one of them, we went deep into this capture resistance concept. But for any listeners who aren't familiar with this, can you just give a brief overview of what you mean by capture resistant organization?
Yeah, it's such a beautiful piece. The article is called Anti-Capture. If you just Google that, you'll be able to find it on Mirror. It's an article written by Spencer in collaboration with a lot of kind of recognizable DAO names, and especially the folks at HATS Protocol. And the whole kind of theory is similar to, if people are aware of OODA loops. It was developed by a fighter pilot some time ago around like this notion of how the brain makes decisions in connection with an environment. So OODA is OODA, which is observe, orient, direct, act. You observe the environment, you orient yourself as an agent in that environment, you direct your attention towards a problem, and then you act in resolution of that problem, which creates stimulus for you to observe again, and you loop through that. And that's borne out really well in the cognitive science. Actually, my undergrad is in neuroscience, which is like a big reason why I'm really interested in this space. And so seeing this article that taps into this concept I was already familiar with and instead breaks it down into, I believe it's, sorry, Spencer, if you're listening and I get this wrong, but I think it's propose, decide, execute, and evaluate are sort of these key steps that any system or individual goes through in making a decision about resources, specifically resources in an environment where some of those are shared between agents and some of those are exclusive to certain agents. And any decision made by agents in a community over those shared resources is subject to capture. Essentially, one of those agents trying to take those shared resources and turning them into private resources, either as a matter of fact or just like as part of the power landscape. And so the main thesis that they present is that decentralizing the ability to exert authority over each of those steps decreases the capturability of the system, or the ability for people to turn public resources into private ones. And especially in the execute step, where you could have some panel maybe coming up with ideas that they suggest to the community, and you could have some other group deciding, for example, like we have elected officials who both propose and decide, and then we have law enforcement or judicial system that executes. In the case of DAOs, in theory, you have a governor contract that executes, and you have smart contract logic that executes. And it ensures that whatever decision was made through the legitimate power structure executes in a deterministic way so that it can't be intentionally misinterpreted in a way that makes public resources private ones. And so, yeah, that's kind of a quick overview of an amazing article that I recommend everybody read, because it's really critical to understanding what is the thing that DAOs are doing right now in relation to power that really taps into what we were talking about before around how can I take an individual system in its own context and increase its resilience and effectiveness.
That was a great overview, and I'll be sure to link the full article in the show notes as well. I think one of the things that draws people to DAOs the most, and which is also one of the biggest challenges about DAOs, is the reduction of any kind of hierarchical structure that people are used to seeing in traditional corporations. And I think the problem with this is some people maybe take it a step too far and aim for a completely flat organizational structure. And I think we've all seen that that doesn't work. And so striking that balance between a flat structure versus a really stringent hierarchical structure, I think is the big challenge that each DAO faces. And there's probably a different answer for each DAO depending on what the DAO is. You've been involved in a number of different DAOs of different sizes that do different things. What have been, this is a big question, so we can definitely dive deeper and unpack it. But what have been some of your biggest learnings about organizing people in DAOs and leadership in DAOs and basically like roles in DAOs?
It's really hard. To a degree, everything in life can be as easy or hard as you make it, but particularly here, it's so new. And so not having a whole class of standard operating procedures to turn to, we're all having to evaluate this in real time. For me, the biggest thing has just been learning to be more humble and maintain a beginner's mindset. And as a governance facilitator, focusing on that second word there is facilitation and drawing the engagement, the ideas, the perspective, the wisdom out of the other people in the system. And the more everybody focuses on that, the more you're stitching together the people involved. And when it comes to like the hierarchy side, there's another great article that I think pairs really well with anti-capture that I think was written in the 70s as part of the women's liberation movement, but it's called The Tyranny of Structurelessness. And it describes this phenomena where in the movement, there were these groups that sprung up around mobilizing people to upend the social systems and achieve equality. And because of that, these were organizations with a very egalitarian grassroots ethos, similar to DAOs. But what people were finding at this time is that they tended to collapse around a social hierarchy based on status, social network integration, who's friends with who, and almost like a PageRank algorithm of the person with the most friends who have the most friends gets a degree of centrality within that network. And that's where things tend to gravitate just as a matter of social physics, not because anybody is really directing it that way. If you have a structureless system, it's not that hierarchy magically dissolves, because there are elements of human sociality and just network science that create centralization of information and context. And so you need a degree of structure, which may take the form of hierarchy, engineered in a deliberate way to break up that natural kind of water only goes downhill sort of mentality or pattern, so that you can have more circulating information and more people hopping in and hopping out of that more central role in the network, to avoid ossification over time around this elite group that just happens to be maybe more extroverted, more connected, and more in the know.
Before starting Rehash, I was a solo creator for many years, and I often felt disconnected and lonely despite doing something I loved. With Rehash, I was seeking more connection and set out to create a community-generated podcast. Since then, I've made genuine connections with community members and fans by co-creating the show. That's why I'm so excited about Lore's launch on Base. Lore is an all-in-one platform for communities to bring their members and their funds on-chain. From there, communities hang out in a forum, crowdsource decisions, and make transactions together. Now, it's easier than ever to fund and co-create media initiatives like Rehash. Go to lore.xyz to kickstart your community initiative today. So I guess the big question is the how, right? That sounds great in theory, and I think most DAOs probably strive for that as well.
Mm-hmm.
But the big question is, how do we create an organization and a system that looks like what you just described? And how do we prevent things from going wrong?
I think leadership is really key, but it's like a different flavor of leadership. There's this Navy SEAL author, podcaster, Jocko Willink, who's sometimes criticized, but like everybody, he has some really useful perspectives. And one of those is this notion of extreme ownership. That as a leader or just a member of an organization, there are things that you control and there are things that you don't control. Standing up for the things that you control and really owning those in relation to other people can create a system of accountability that helps to ensure everybody's speaking up, everybody's participating, and you can develop trust. Once you have that, I think there's a substrate where you can create structure a lot more. And that's where I think a tool like Hats comes in. Metropolis is another great example of trying to create some structure, some rules-based system for soft hierarchy that's still controlled by the collective, so that you can have bottom-up control of the top-down mechanisms. One of the big things that article, Tyranny of Structurelessness, suggests is to have positions of power regularly rotate, to have democratic input into the roles and responsibilities of the people holding those positions, to name those positions, to not let them just form by accident and stay in the shadows, state them explicitly so that they can be understood by the whole group. In DAOs, it's easy to keep things fuzzy or to rely too much on coding everything into smart contracts. But there's stuff that, at least in the short term, falls in between. As soon as you have an idea, you can't go write down all those words in stone of exactly how it's going to work, especially when you're in conjunction with other people. So you have to go through layers of consensus building. And so for us at Rare DAO, this is like Brennan has an idea. He writes it in Apple Notes, takes a screenshot, and shares it with somebody. That person gives gut feedback. Then it goes into a Google Doc, and more people talk about it. And then we have a documentation repository with all of our proposals for our council. And it goes in there, and then we vote on it, or it goes to a public proposal. And there's these layers of consensus generation based on the people who hold these certain positions. And the danger there is that that social network that forms around that becomes closed. And now you just have a small group of people thinking about stuff and sharing it with each other, which means they're the ones who are able to think of more stuff. And so the real challenge is being able to progressively grow that circle, cycle people in and out, And I think the closest thing I've seen to that being done successfully is what Haberdasher Labs is doing with the Hats Proto DAO, where they've been incubating this thing for a while. People like you and I have been talking to them for a long time. And then they set up this circle of people to help launch a thing. None of us know what it's going to look like, but it's them expanding that concentric circle of context and inclusion gradually over time.
Yeah, I think that problem you said about a lot of DAOs turning into this inclusive group of people, I think that's also how a lot of DAOs begin as well.
Mm-hmm.
At least from what I've seen, is a group of friends get together and form some sort of community organized around a certain goal. And then they grow that from the same group. And what I've noticed, at least, is, and maybe this is a problem I have that I need to fix, but I see the same people in all of these different DAOs that I'm part of, or all of these different organizations that I'm part of. And I will say that Haberdasher Labs has done a good job with the Hats Proto DAO, because I have met actually a number of people that I didn't know before, like yourself, that I haven't experienced in a while, because it's literally the same group of people that I see over and over and over again. And it's comfortable. I mean, it's fun. It's like all of my friends, we know each other. We know how each other communicates. We know how to interpret each other. We know how each other works. It almost makes sense in a way to work with people that you already know. But obviously, we want to have more inclusivity too and bring more people into the fold. What have you seen are some good strategies, like tangible things that people or organizations can do to expand that circle and to prioritize inclusivity as much as they prioritize efficiency and getting stuff done?
We certainly haven't figured out how to do it perfectly at RareDAO, but there are a couple things we've done that I think help, is to find the right balance between formal and informal community engagement. So we do these regular DAO town halls. They used to be every 2 weeks. Now they're more around when specific proposals are happening and there's regular things to discuss. But we were doing it every 2 weeks. And when I started, I didn't know anybody in this community. So I started what I call was like MetaGov and Chill, where I just got on Discord for an hour. And it was a Discord stage. Anybody who hopped in the room, I invited them up on stage right away. And we just talked about stuff. And I met people there who have really good ideas, but they weren't part of that social elite. They weren't one of the early successful artists on SuperRare. They weren't a member of SuperRare Labs, but they had ideas that I was able to incorporate into our strategy around the DAO that have really transformed the way that we think. So just increasing surface area and contact with community members, leaving that door open for, like the meet cutes in a rom-com. Like none of those movies would work without that degree of entropy where two people bump into each other randomly and a spark of connection happens. So building that into your DAOs, I think, is really important, because if you just have the same molecules bumping into each other, they're going to keep making the same compounds. But as soon as you have new molecules in the mix and there's a bit of chaos and more energy in that social network, new things will start to form. And then the other one is sort of contradictory to that, but still really important, is on the more formal side, to have that really well structured, to have clear processes for the organization. So we have bylaws, which I know not everybody reads, but the fact is that there is a way things are done, and it's encoded in a document. That is difficult to read, but some people know how it works, and it provides a degree of predictability. And when something comes up, we know how to deal with it, and that can be explained. So often it is completely illegible, and there is no plan for when there's not a plan, which is like a hat tip to Disruption Joe. I remember when there was a particular budget discussion around Gitcoin, he was like, it's really important that we have a plan for when there is no plan, because that is when, no matter how well designed your social system is, it's going to collapse back into that social elite. And it's going to go back into DMs. As soon as it can't be captured in a DAO proposal or a snapshot vote or a push request, it's going to collapse into where people feel comfortable, like you were saying, because really what happens there is there's familiarity. You're able to form a shorthand, and there's trust. You know that incentives are aligned, and you're able to predict each other's thoughts, feelings, and actions. And that's really what trust is, the ability to project into the future how other people will behave in alignment with you. And so creating an environment where you have more of that predictability through shared procedures and norms through well-established procedures for the organization is really useful. And then just maintaining clear documentation. We have a repository that shows every decision that our semi-centralized council has made, both in regards to like the multi-sig, but then also more administrative aspects. So when we have a conversation with somebody and they ask, where did this particular thing happen? We can give them a document that shows the background, the resolution, and like the authorities that went into that decision, which provides, I call it like a context ladder, because so much of integrating yourself into these systems that are supposedly decentralized is just being able to penetrate that social network and speak the same language as people. And that's something that I dealt with when I joined ATX DAO. Something I dealt with getting into conversations like these as somebody who joined the DAO space later. There is a bit of that social elite, and it takes people like David from Hats and Nick and Spencer. They do a great job of bringing new people in and weaving them together, but then you have to figure out what the shared language is. And the more that DAOs are able to collect that information within their own org, document that, and then weave that into the way they interact with their communities, I think the more network traversability there will be, if that makes sense. Like it becomes easier to move within an organization and between organizations because you have more legibility into how things are working.
I think a lot of where that awkwardness or conflict can arise is trying to strike that balance between the centralized and the decentralized decision making. When you can't come to a decision with the whole group, and that's when the leaders step in a lot of instances and kind of make that call for everybody. And something that we did at Rehash last season is we actually polled the community and asked them how much power they're comfortable with giving to the Rehash core team versus having a community vote. And we listed out a few of the main activities that go on in Rehash. And it was interesting to see their take on all these different actions and which ones they're more comfortable giving full power to the core team. Like, you please handle this for us, versus things that they're like, no, we definitely want to say on this. Have you done anything like that in any of the DAOs you were part of, or how have you come to understand where that line is that your community feels comfortable with you taking centralized action as a leader versus deferring to the community fully?
I haven't done that particular process. That sounds really cool. I mean, the interesting thing with SuperRare is, I joined a year after the DAO was formed. And so we already had bylaws at that time. So I wasn't able to participate in that process, because essentially that's some of what y'all did right there, was get community feedback into designing the system of power. What are the roles and responsibilities held by this party, which is a lot of what our bylaws look like for the Rare DAO Foundation, where it says there is a council composed of this many people. These are the sorts of actions they can take under which conditions that can have these effects. And that is really important to have documented. And it's even better that you guys were able to have that conversation about what is and isn't included. Before I kind of talk more about that, I'm curious, were there things that came out of that process that surprised you? And if you have some examples of stuff that you thought they would want more input in and then didn't, and then things that you didn't think they would care about, but they did.
Some of the questions we asked were, for example, if we have a guest that's voted on to a season and isn't able to come on this season, but has time to come on a future season, should the core team just decide to let them on or not, even though it's for a future season? Or another big question was actually, if we have a guest that's voted on and we have a conversation, we record the podcast episode, and it just doesn't turn out to be the level of quality that we're comfortable putting Rehash's name behind, what should we do? Do we need to have a community vote and ask them whether, we just scrap this episode, don't publish it, or will they defer to the core team to decide that? And most people said they just defer to the core team. So basically they said, say like a guest gets voted on and they just have nothing interesting to say and it's not a good episode, then they're like, yeah, scrap it. You don't have to ask us. So I do remember that was a surprising result to me, at least.
That's really interesting. And that's why trust is so important, because what they're saying right there is like, when we think about, okay, that scenario arises, I think Diana would make this sort of decision with this sort of motivation. And the fact that you have a relationship with your audience and your community members where there is that trust is what allows for that centralization in this particular responsibility to bear fruit. So it's really interesting to think about the role of trust in centralization. We use trust as a bad word a lot of the time, right? Like we want trustless systems and that sort of thing. But the fact is you cannot have humans networking with each other without trust. One of the areas where I've focused more in the past is in the communication patterns. So almost even before it gets to that point where this goes from a forum to a group chat. And what are the elements in that maybe could have happened publicly? Or once a small group kind of breaks off, discusses something, how do you push that context back into the main information channel? Because I found, with ATX DAO, it started, like you said, essentially a little social elite that bumped into each other, started drinking beer together, decided that they wanted to do this NFT-based DAO thing because it would be fun. And so we were sort of just hanging out in a social network where you get that, centralization over time based on the people who've been there the longest, devote the most time, or the most charismatic, that sort of thing. And as we started to mature a little bit more, and particularly when we were working on that legislation and we were really trying to do something with impact, we ran into that situation where, why is this happening over a text message? Could this be something that we bring up in our weekly call on Discord? Always looking for those opportunities to push information from the center of the graph to the outside of the graph and pushing things to the edges. That's kind of where I've focused more. And what I found is when you focus on that, the system and the community tend to bubble up those preferences back to you in a good way. Access to information is access to decision making because you can't expect people to participate if they have no idea what's going on. And so the first thing to focus on is making sure that context is disseminated. And that's the hardest part to do. ATX DAO doesn't really exist in an adversarial environment. It's not like there's another DAO in Austin that's trying to do a bunch of stuff. So we don't have to think about competitors or other things, but SuperRare is just one NFT marketplace and a whole ecosystem of NFT marketplaces. And there are employees and probably other people involved with competing marketplaces that are token holders of the DAO. And so where do you draw that line in context dissemination? And that's probably very similar to that trust thing around like, if the podcast is not good, what are we able to do? Do we have this trust to be able to do some R&D behind the scenes and then surface that to the community when we feel it's ready and able to be viable in a market setting?
That's so true. I really like that connection between trust and centralization that you raised. Is the more you trust your leaders, the more centralization you're okay with as a community member.
Yeah, to touch on that really quick, I mean, it's something both to cultivate and be afraid of. And that's the delicate balance. Complex dynamic systems are all about parameter optimization. And so here we have trustfulness and trustlessness as a spectrum in which we have to constantly optimize. And there is not an answer. That's why, to go back to the beginning of the conversation, for me, it's all about context. You cannot say DAOs work this way universally, because when I'm writing a proposal for Rare DAO in this particular competitive environment with this particular amount of information going into it, because you know how DAO proposals, they evolve so much all the way until the point that they get voted on. And even then there's a degree of iteration. And so it has to be based on that feeling into the information the system is giving you at the time. And that's what makes it particularly difficult. And I think that is part of the role of skillful individuals in interacting with these systems, to be able to pull the people together and that feeling into the context together to discern where the right touches of centralization are and where they shouldn't be. And that hopefully is part of the role that governance facilitators can play.
I don't know how many of you know this about me, but my path to podcasting in Web3 was actually quite nonlinear. From being a lawyer to a travel blogger to a podcaster and so many other little things in between. Because of this convoluted journey, I've always struggled with how to tell my full story via traditional means like a resume or LinkedIn bio, and I always felt there was so much context missing from these mediums that probably left any potential client or employer reading it totally confused about who I am or what I can offer. So while I absolutely love certain aspects of being self-employed, like being my own boss and being able to set my own schedule, there are other aspects that have been a constant source of frustration, like the fact that existing apps and tooling don't seem to be built for self-employed people at all. That's why I'm so excited about Quests, a new platform that lets me record all of my contributions on chain, decide which projects I want to showcase, and take control of my professional identity. To follow along with our Rehash quests and check out my profile, you can sign up at quest.com/DC so you never miss an episode and create your own Quest profile today. I want to zoom out from the people structure of DAOs a little bit and get more into the organization as a whole. One of the buzzwords that we heard a lot of a couple of years ago was progressive decentralization. All of these organizations wanted to decentralize into a DAO, and from what I've seen, most of them didn't work. I was curious to hear your thoughts on how you think is the best way for an organization to decentralize, and whether you think progressive decentralization is possible at all, or if an organization needs to start with that decentralization in mind if they want to end up there.
So I think anything that scales needs to progressively decentralize. Because if you start decentralized in a group of 10 people, and let's say you have a governor contract and some sort of fair use token distribution mechanism that from a technical angle ensures that as a system scales, that it remains capture resistant and that decision-making authority is equally distributed. Even if you have that technical side fully figured out, there will be 10 people who were there longer than everybody else, who were there when the ideas were first had, who've seen all the mistakes and all the successes. That's context. And that can't be decentralized in the smart contract. That is a culture that needs to be able to grow and expand to include those other 90 people. And that is the most challenging thing, I think, because it's an uphill battle. Some people have been around longer. They know more. They know who to talk to. And so how do you build in a culture of constantly encouraging newcomers to come into that inner circle? Because a lot of times there's fear or that feeling of, oh, I don't know if like it's the right thing for me. Like you guys have been here so much longer. I trust you. There's that theme of trust. As leaders in a DAO, or those people who just happen to have been around longer and hold more context, you have to pull people in. You can't expect it to happen passively. And that, I think, is what Haberdasher Labs has done really well, where they did the thinking for a while as their sort of group of, first it was just, the three of them, and then they brought on some more people and they've been having conversations, and they got to a point where like, okay, it's time for us to go find people that we think are going to contribute well and yoink them into the system and force the context down to the edge of that graph so that each time we expand the size of the network, we can just keep pushing information out. And so that highlights the two layers to the progressive decentralization discussion around the social side and the technical side. One of the things I've kind of workshopped with the HATS folks is the legal side too. Like Spencer, Nick, and I in conversation came up with this term legalware as opposed to socialware or trustware. All three are really important to running a decentralized organization. And the legalware serves, that's like having strong bylaws and almost more traditional corporate governance, but organized around this fundamentally open and inclusive perspective, can help create structure that bridges that technical side along with that social one to ensure that at the people level, we're taking certain steps to keep the system open and the resources flowing freely.
What do you think about compensation models within DAOs? Do you think that, sorry, I don't know if we even want to go there.
I only laugh because I'm literally halfway through writing that proposal right now. Like literally right before this podcast, I was writing a proposal for that.
Amazing. Well, I'm just going to let you take it away and tell us your learnings on that.
I was hoping you would take it away because it's confusing. It's hard. It's really hard, especially when you're working with a token that's not native to the chain or the US global hegemony. So we have our rare token, right? So should our council members be compensated in USDC? Should they be compensated in ETH? Should they be compensated in rare? Some mix of the three. If they're compensated in rare, is it a flat amount that is just 50 rare all the time, no matter what its price is? Or is it 50 worth of rare paid in certain installments? It just comes down to context. Obviously, that proposal is still in drafting, so I won't talk about the specific discussion too openly until we have a chance to discuss it with more community members. But it's hard. And I think part of what makes it hard is there's not established models for how other people are doing it. I do think compensation is really important. You need skin in the game. Even if you have the perfect volunteer, they're still showing up freely of their own accord. It's unfair to really have an expectation. If that person has life stuff come up or they lose interest, you can't really blame them because they were there for free the whole time. And as soon as you start paying somebody, and as soon as you set up expectations for performance, attendance, engagement, now the DAO is able to ask things of that person rather than them offering freely. And that's really important, particularly in a time like this, where we see enthusiasm being really high one summer and then really low the next summer. And some of that feeds into the compensation model. Like if you compensate in a flat amount of DAO tokens, if that token drops, let's say it drops 50%, they're being paid half as much as they were before. They just got a huge pay cut. That would be unacceptable in a traditional job. If you got a 50% pay cut and your boss expected you to show up and do the same work, you would tell them to F off and quit. But in DAOs, that's almost normal because we think in terms of incentives and there is an element of line goes up thinking that happens sometimes. So yeah, I don't have an answer. It's a really complicated problem. I think that we should probably, as members of the DAO community, share more about how we've solved that problem in our own context so that we can learn collectively about what has worked and what hasn't, because it is messy and it is context dependent. And until we develop good norms and practices as an industry, people have to build it from scratch every time.
Yeah, I think that social and psychological component is what is most interesting and thought-provoking to me, is the idea that once you start paying somebody, it changes that relationship entirely, right? It's like, say you're like a gardening expert and you love gardening and I want to start gardening, and you say, hey, I'll come over and I'll help you get started on gardening. I love doing it. We can have some beers and hang out and I'll help you with gardening. And I'm like, oh, this is great. And you come over every week and help me. And then all of a sudden I'm like, you're spending a lot of time working on my garden. I feel like I should pay you. Then that just changes that relationship dynamic a lot from we were just friends having beers, hanging out, and also planting some plants to now I probably expect you to come over every week, even if you're busy. And it's a lot harder for you to get out of that if you're not feeling well one day or you're just like not in the mood. And that over time could easily have a strain on our friendship from just doing this fun thing together and hanging out to now we're almost like an employer-employee relationship. And I wonder if that happens in DAOs as well, where you see these people come into DAOs who are really passionate about the DAO's mission, what they're doing, giving away their time for free to volunteer. Obviously, the downside of that for the DAO is if the person loses interest or something comes up, they can just dip out. And then all of a sudden you've lost a core contributor. But once you start paying them, then as a paid DAO contributor, then I start thinking, well, are they paying me enough? Is this, how much work do they expect me to do versus
you enter into that transact mindset
right.
rather than freely giving.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And this is slightly tangential, but I have a good family friend who's a life coach, and he doesn't charge like his friends or his family members, but he does. He because he's like, it's important if I'm going to invest time in you, it's important for you to have some conviction. Like, you know, if it's just, oh, I'm going to help over and lend a hand to help you grow your garden versus, oh, you want me to kind of compile some research about what plants might work well and your, you know, biome and based on your water conditions, and I'll bring that info for us next weekend. Well, if I'm the gardening expert and I invest this time into you, and for you, it's sort of just a hanging out thing and you don't necessarily realize what you're asking of me. And then I go through that work because I want to, you know, contribute to the friendship and that sort of thing. But then you're just kind of like, yeah, maybe I don't care that much, or like, I'm just in it for fun. It creates a checkpoint where you can align expectations and both sides can understand what they should bring to the table. That structurelessness there is a beautiful thing. like we were talking about before, and organizing a group of people hanging out, drinking beer can spin up a DAO that changes the crypto landscape in a city, like ATX DAO did. But then, you run into a situation down the line where there's not good structure and some feelings get hurt. And so that exists between people too. And how you do that in a healthy way, I think is really difficult. But yeah, I think it's just important that it's talked about, particularly in American culture. We don't talk openly about wages in our workplaces. And I don't think that works or is good in hierarchical structures. It's good for the hierarchical structure, but it's not good for the people in the hierarchical structure. But when it's a situation where we're all stakeholders in the success of the organization and we all hold decision-making authority, it's really important that we have those discussions with each other, because there's not some CEO who's just going to decide. We're the people who are deciding together. So we have to get over that initial awkwardness and have those difficult conversations.
The one thing I have seen work is just speaking openly about it. If somebody's interested in helping out with Rehash, they come to us with some sort of proposal. This is what I want to work on, and this is how much I charge. And all of that is set up front. And then we can make a decision if that's the right fit or not. But I actually think that's a much better process than like somebody who comes to us and says, hey, I'm so passionate about Rehash, like love Rehash, want to do blah, blah, blah for you. And they end up doing all this free work. I almost feel like the compensation discussion is harder to bring up the deeper you get into that relationship. It's better to just talk about it up front. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, maybe it's like the discussion around kids in a relationship. Like you don't want to bring it up on the first date, but you don't want to wait like 10 years either.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think a lot of it is related to trust. Having somebody update your logo or these different things, that's stuff that takes time to implement, and it takes resources on both sides. Even if it's that person doing the work, maybe you're holding off on doing other things until that work is done. And going back to trust is the ability to predict the actions of another agent and know that they're in alignment with your goals. So if you don't have some substrate, either from a really long social relationship and social history, or something more formal in the form of like, hey, I'm a contractor, I do this a lot, this is my typical structure. You don't have that substrate for predictability that allows both parties to project how this relationship is going to work into the future. And that's really hard in DAOs, I think, where a lot of us tend to be more loosey-goosey, go with the flow type people, which is why maybe we're drawn to this work and this type of social organizing. But there's a reason why society is structured the way it is sometimes. And so we could certainly bring a degree of formality to those discussions and those interactions so that we're able to kind of maintain the loosey-goosiness once all the sticky details are figured out.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we're coming up on time. I did also want to ask you one last random thing, which is about tackling your first ultra trail run in January, which I'm super excited about. A lot of the people in my community here run ultras on a regular basis. So that's kind of gotten me interested in ultra running. But I wanted to ask how your experience with that has been, how your training's coming along.
I have time to talk about this a little bit longer because now we're jamming. But I grew up hiking a lot. I grew up in the Front Range of Colorado. We had a little cabin by Estes Park, and I grew up in the mountains doing mountain stuff. And so I feel really at home in the trails. They've been there for me at really difficult points in my life to just be able to be in nature and participating. And I like to call it like the meta complex system, like just the way that everything organizes on its own, of its own accord. And ecology, to be able to be a person in that is a big release. In particular, the way that we participate in nature, we don't really even participate in nature that often. We observe nature. And so when you're out there on a trail, busting your ass in flow state in that environment, and particularly when you're moving fast on a trail that's very technical, and you have to think like you're a part of the trail and where you're putting each footfall, I feel a deeper integration with that system of the forest or the desert hills, wherever I am. You kind of have both here in Texas. So I've just always loved being on trails. When I moved to Austin, just by pure luck, right across from my street, there was this awesome little spider web of mountain bike trails. And COVID happened a month after I moved into that apartment. So I just started spending time out there. I would walk a ton, listen to audiobooks. And then I was like, well, what if I tried running on some of them? So I did that. And I kind of casually trail ran for several years. But then at a crypto event in Austin, I met a guy who had just moved to the States. His name's Charlie Sarmiento, and he's a professional ultra runner. I asked him, "You're new in town. What do you like to do?" And he says, "I like to trail run." And I said, "I like to trail run too." Turns out the first time we run together, it's 6:30 in the morning. It's dark. I've never done that for a run. He shows up in his Guatemalan national jersey, like ready to go. And that's kind of been the start of the journey since then, just getting more serious about it. And then one of my coworkers was like, "Hey, there's a 50K an hour away from us." We both live in San Antonio. And so we decided to do it. So the training's going well so far. The piece that's difficult is just managing the different resource systems. And this is sort of the analogy to DAOs that you and I were messaging about yesterday. I like to think of, well, the body is a DAO, first of all. Like, just like, the forest is a DAO, there's no neuron in the brain that is in charge of all the other neurons. The glycogen in our liver is a shared resource that no one cell in the body has capture over, right? So there's a capture resistant system where all the different organs and participants in the human body are continuously negotiating with each other, communicating with each other to determine which resources go where, which information is carried along which pathways. And when you're at rest, you don't really need to be an active participant in that system. You can kind of just go about your day. But when you're pushing hard, when you've been running for 3 hours, your glycogen is gone, it's hot, and you're thirsty, you have to think about the more base aspects of your existence. Like, am I getting carbohydrates? Am I getting water? Am I getting enough sodium? And what's the relationship between all three of those things? Because my food has water and sodium in it, but that's mainly for sugar. But my water has both of those other things. And so you kind of have to do that parameter optimization. And then you get kind of loopy when you run for a long time, and you start to get this feeling of feeling decentralized, like feeling like I am a system. I'm not an individual thing. I'm a liver working with a pancreas, working with a brain, working with feet, and we're just going along this goal. And there's something about the way that system is arranged that makes me want to do great things. And I want to do things that are hard. I want to organize social systems that we don't totally know how they work yet. And I want to, for some reason, go off and run 31 miles in the hills with one of my best friends. And the fact that comes from this sort of symphony of organs and organelles all dancing together and the physiological soup is really cool. And I feel that more when I run. And I think that's ultimately what keeps driving me towards it.
You just articulated, I think, everything that I've been thinking and feeling and not really understanding why I felt that way. You just articulated all of that perfectly. So thank you for
I've had a lot of time to think about it as I run like 40 hours or 40 miles a week. Yeah,
that's true. I finally understand my own thoughts and my own life. Thank you. Also, I don't know if you experience this too, but for me personally, like, I mostly just do activities outside as exercise. So hiking, trail running, skiing in the winter, but I'm not a big gym rat. Like, I don't enjoy going to the gym and lifting weights. And I think that's been a challenge too, is like understanding that strength training and weight training is also important to accomplish seemingly purely cardio goals that you have. It's just been really interesting to like learn more about how the body works together as a system through things like this.
Balance in particular is really interesting to me. And it's a big part of trail running because every footfall is different. But it's cybernetics, it's feedback loops. Like, one muscle pulls on another muscle. And if you stand on, I have this thing over here, it's called a Dynadisc. And it's like sort of an oblong, perfectly unflat. No way.
Dude, I can't even make it up. It's literally right next to me.
And so you stand on that and your ankle just starts going like this, right? And you want that because it's all those muscles working. And, you don't tell it to move right or left, but you channel focus into that joint and your skill improves there. And it's one of those other places where I feel that felt experience of participating in something that is going on in my body, where it's not me telling my ankle, move right, move left. It's me facilitating resources and information in a way that helps the ankle do its job as part of this decentralized system. And strength training is such a big piece of that because as runners, it's something that we don't always like to do, but it's something that the system asks us to do. And so there's sort of those like $ strength holders in our multi-token governance system. You have $ endurance, $ strength. And like the strength side definitely has voting power. And you feel that when you're 18 miles in and you start to cramp because there's too much fatigue in those muscles and they aren't properly conditioned. I like to think about the different metabolic systems in my body and the different parts of my body as stakeholders in this sort of like governance system, and making sure that they're all enfranchised and committed to the same goal and equally prepared to embark on that goal together. And I don't know if that's actually like a good mental model or how well that plays out in the biology, but it's sort of a fun way for me to bridge my work and my play.
Absolutely. I'm really glad we got to talking about that, but we will wrap up and get you going. The last question I ask everybody on every episode is one sourced from the community. So I'm going to actually give you 3 questions to choose from. You only have to answer one, and these are all submitted by the community. The first one is from Meg Lister, and it is, what's your favorite crypto drama, and tell us about it. The second one, also from Meg Lister, is who would you invite on the podcast next season? And then the third question is from Floppy Abe, and it is, estimate your success rate in your attempts to crypto pill your off-chain friends and family members. Paint me a word picture of your average attempt.
I'm going to try to do all 3 quickly, if that's okay. 'Cause they're all great questions.
Love it,
so
love it.
Starting with the third one, I don't try to crypto pill. I try to system pill. Like get people to think about the fact that there's nothing in their body that decides for everything else. It's a collaborative process between all these different systems and types of energy and types of cells and all that stuff. A lot of people criticize crypto for being a solution in search of a problem. I think framing the perspective from which crypto generates meaning for a lot of us, which is rooted in systems and decentralization. If you can instill that perspective in people, then what we're doing here on the financial and organizational side affords itself more easily. But you have to find the way that systems present themselves in somebody's life in order for that transformation to occur individually. As far as podcast guests, Mason Lina is one of the co-founders of ATX DAO and just a fantastic person. What he's done with that organization, and talk about somebody who's gone through that progressive decentralization process where you are hanging out with friends drinking, and all of a sudden you have a treasury of $200,000, hundreds of members, and trying to figure out how to keep that fun for people and give people agency. He's a great person to talk to. And then what was the first question again?
It was, what's your favorite crypto drama?
Oh, dude, it's not crypto, but the OpenAI stuff the last 2 weeks has been awesome, because people, I don't think, realize the degree to which even corporations are somewhat decentralized, like IPOs and boards. Democracy is built into some of these centralized structures. It's a very capture prone and plutocratic form, but there is still this element. And so seeing that drama play out, and of course, we don't have all the information yet about what was going on behind the scenes that led to the board ousting Sam Altman, and then everybody fleeing to Microsoft, and then the board deciding to back off and step down. It's almost more interesting not having that information, because it sort of pierced the veil of OpenAI is a thing that exists on its own. And then we saw that meme break down overnight, and we realized it's all just people who make decisions. And that's not always coordinated. And the sort of delusion field around OpenAI as a singular object broke all of a sudden. And it's like, well, if all the engineers leave OpenAI and go to Microsoft, is it still OpenAI? Does Microsoft now become de facto OpenAI, even though they don't have that trademark? It's just a really interesting case study in the way that social influence and real quote unquote power over the bylaws of that board interact in a very interesting way that can create flashpoints.
Well, thank you so much, Brennan, for taking the time. Before you go, tell people where they can find you if they want to connect with you personally. And then feel free to plug away at anything SuperRare related, or Rare DAO, or hats, or anything else you're working on.
For sure. Twitter is probably the best way. It's at bmulligan. And yeah, I'm always down to chat and hear what people are going through and just have interesting conversations. That's what it's all about for me. We're doing a lot right now at SuperRare. Check out forum.superrare.com. We have a RFC that we put out a week and a half ago, sort of reframing like the vision of not necessarily the SuperRare platform, but our protocol and the whole organization around it. And, just hats it's really happening. If for some reason by now you don't know what's totally going on there, definitely check it out. I know that we have a demo day coming up in early December that I've been helping David organize along with yourself. So maybe we can throw the link to that down below as well. And then if you're in the Austin area, atxdao.com, join the Discord, talk to people. You're going to meet like some of the most amazing crypto people that you've ever met. And to be able to do that in a local community is really special. Other than that, I was wondering if it was okay if I share a running quote that I think is very applicable for this point in the market.
Definitely.
Awesome. It's from Dag Hammarskjöld, who I think was the Secretary General of the UN at some point in like the 50s or whatever. But here it is. When the morning's freshness has been replaced by the weariness of midday, when your leg muscles quiver under the strain, the climb seems endless, and suddenly nothing will go quite as you wish. It is then that you must not hesitate.
Love that.
Just keep
what
going.
A great
just
note.
Keep taking steps and we'll all get there.
It's such a good bear market quote too. Don't give up. Keep going. Think about Brennan running his 50K in January and just think whatever you're doing can't be as bad as that. So don't give up. Keep going. Thank you so much, Brennan, for taking the time. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And we'll be back again next week with another episode of Rehash. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Rehash. Rehash is hosted, produced, and edited by me, Diana Chen, and sponsored by Quest and Lore. Rehash is also supported by our community of NFT holders who curate our guest lineup each season. To get involved, head over to our website at rehashweb3.xyz and collect this episode as an NFT. Anyone who collects an episode becomes part of the Rehash community and will be able to nominate guests for future seasons. To learn more about how to become a guest on the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/podcast. And to learn more about sponsoring the podcast, go to rehashweb3.xyz/sponsor. Finally, be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at rehashweb3 or on Lens at rehash.lens. And don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.